All right, so listen to this. Okay. You got a guy calling 911 claiming he just got chased off a cliff by a bear.
Oh, wow.
Sounds like a bad nature documentary, right? But guess what? It's all a lie.
Really?
Yeah, cover up for something way darker.
Oh, my gosh.
We're diving deep into the case of Stephen Lloyd and the man who orchestrated his demise, Nicholas Hamlett.
Okay.
Initially hiding behind the name Brandon Andrade. We've got stolen identities, a chase across state lines, and a criminal history that's basically a giant red flag waving in the wind.
It's almost unbelievable the lengths some people will go to. You'd think in this day and age, with all the technology and investigative tools, pulling off a deception that big would be impossible.
You're telling me? Okay, so let's rewind to the beginning.
Right.
It's October 18th, late at night in eastern Tennessee.
Okay.
This frantic 911 call comes in.
Wow.
The dispatcher on the other end hears this story about a bear attack, a dying phone.
Oh, God.
It's pure chaos.
And the caller, claiming to be Brandon Andrade, is injured. His phone's about to die.
Right.
It's all very dramatic, very urgent.
Yeah.
But for authorities, this kind of over-the-top story often sets off alarm bells.
Makes sense. The Knoxville News Sentinel actually obtained a recording of that 911 call.
Oh.
And listening to it, you can't help but think, even with the panic tone, there's something just off about it.
Really?
Almost like the guy's trying too hard.
Exactly. Experienced investigators are trained to listen for those subtle inconsistencies, those little details that don't quite add up.
So investigators arrive at the scene, and what do they find?
They discover a body.
Okay.
But it's not Brandon Andrade, the guy from the 911 call.
Oh, wow.
It's someone else entirely.
And the deceased man does have an ID on him, identifying him as Brandon Andrade.
Yeah, but investigators quickly discover it's stolen.
Hold on. So Hamlett is using a stolen identity and faking a bear attack.
Yep.
This is getting ridiculous.
And it just gets more bizarre from there. It's like Hamlet threw a bunch of random crime drama tropes into a blender and hoped for the best.
Wow.
But the problem with elaborate lies is that they tend to unravel.
Right.
Especially when you underestimate the power of good old-fashioned police work.
Okay, so how did they figure out who the victim really was?
Yeah.
And that this whole bear attack scenario was completely fabricated?
Well, for starters, the scene itself didn't match up with the story Hamlet spun on that 911 call. Forensics teams are incredibly meticulous. They're looking at everything. Footprints blood spatter the position of the body.
So basically they're treating the whole area like a giant puzzle, right?
Exactly. And every piece that doesn't fit throws the entire picture into question.
Oh, I see.
Then you have witness interviews, people who might have seen the victim or the suspect in the days leading up to the incident.
Right.
It's amazing how much information investigators can glean from seemingly unrelated sources.
It's true. And in this case, one of the most crucial pieces of the puzzle was connecting Hamlet to his previous aliases.
Right.
This guy had a history of adopting false identities.
Yeah.
That pattern of deception ultimately became his downfall.
Wow.
Talk about a rookie mistake.
Right.
If you're going to try and disappear, maybe don't leave a trail of fake names scattered across multiple states.
Right. You'd think that would be criminal deception 101.
Yeah.
But it seems Hamlet's arrogance blinded him to the obvious. He really thought he was smarter than everyone else.
So while all this is going on, investigators are trying to piece together who the victim of Stephen Lloyd actually was.
Right.
He's more than just a name on a case file.
Absolutely. And understanding Stephen Lloyd is key to grasping the real tragedy of this case. Statements from the Monroe County Sheriff's Office paint a picture of a man who had a troubled past growing up in the foster care system and struggling with mental health.
That's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Especially knowing that those vulnerabilities may have made him a target for someone like Hamlet.
It's a sad reality that predators often prey on individuals they perceive as weak or easy to manipulate. And in Lloyd's case, his struggles with trust and forming attachments, likely stemming from a condition called reactive attachment disorder, might have made him particularly susceptible.
Reactive attachment disorder. That sounds intense.
Right.
What exactly does that mean?
It's a complex condition that can develop in early childhood.
Okay.
When children experience disruptions in their primary caregiving relationships, they have difficulty forming healthy emotional bonds, which can lead to struggles with trust, emotional regulation, and forming stable relationships later in life.
That makes sense. So essentially, Lloyd's past experiences might have made it difficult for him to discern genuine intentions from manipulation.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's what makes this case even more tragic.
Right.
Lloyd's desire for connection, his longing to trust people, might have been what led him into harm's way.
It's a stark reminder that the world can be a dangerous place, especially for those who are already carrying a heavy load.
Indeed. And it underscores the importance of creating support systems for vulnerable individuals, providing them with the resources and guidance they need to navigate a world that can often feel unpredictable and unsafe.
Okay, so we've got a vulnerable victim,
Yeah.
a suspect with a history of deception, and a cover story. It's straight out of a B movie.
Oh, okay.
But hold on, because we're just getting started.
Okay.
Hamlet's criminal past is a whole other chapter in this twisted tale.
Oh, you're not kidding.
Yeah.
When you look at his past offenses, it's clear that this whole Tennessee episode wasn't just a random act of desperation. There's a pattern here, a chilling consistency in his methods that makes this case even more disturbing.
So spill the tea. What kind of criminal mastermind are we dealing with here?
Well, in 2009 in Alabama, Hamlett pulled a stunt that's almost a blueprint for what he attempted with Stephen Lloyd.
Really?
He held a man at gunpoint, tried to bash his head in with a baseball bat,
Oh my gosh.
and even had plans to bury the body in a remote area.
Wait, seriously, it's like he thought he was writing his own crime novel, except the ending didn't quite go according to plan.
Right. It's almost comical how closely the two incidents mirror each other.
Wow.
The attempted murder, the planned disposal of the body, the blatant disregard for human life, it's all there.
Which makes you wonder, was he getting cocky? Did he genuinely think he could pull off the same stunt twice and get away with it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Was it arrogance?
Right.
Delusion? A complete lack of remorse? Or maybe a combination of all three?
Whatever it was,
Yeah.
it's clear that Hamlet was operating under the assumption that he was some kind of criminal mastermind capable of outsmarting everyone.
Right.
And for a while, it seemed like he might actually pull it off.
Yeah.
The manhunt for Hamlet spanned weeks
I know.
and involved a whole alphabet soup of law enforcement agencies.
Wow.
The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation,
Right.
the FBI U.S. Marshals,
Oh, my goodness.
they were all on his trail.
And this wasn't just some local search party, right? This guy
Yeah.
was crossing state lines, actively trying to vanish.
Exactly. Which makes his eventual capture even more remarkable. All right, so before we get into the thrilling conclusion of the great Hamlet chase, let's take a moment to consider the audacity of this whole situation.
Okay.
We're talking about a guy who concocted a plan so outlandish, so blatantly ridiculous,
Yeah.
that it's almost hard to believe he thought it would work.
You're telling me. It's like he was living in his own reality show, convinced he could pull the wool over everyone's eyes and emerge as the ultimate victor.
It's almost as if he underestimated the sheer absurdity of it all.
Yeah.
It's one thing to lie to try and cover your tracks, but to invent a scenario so utterly preposterous,
Right.
it's like he was daring the authorities to catch him.
And in a way he was. Because the more elaborate the lie, the more likely it is to crumble under scrutiny.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened.
So let's dive into the manhunt itself.
Okay.
This guy was on the run for weeks, crisscrossing state lines, constantly looking over his shoulder. You've got to admit, there's a certain level of intrigue, a sense of, can he actually get away with it?
Oh, absolutely. And the authorities had their work cut out for them. This wasn't just a matter of finding a needle in a haystack.
Right.
It was like searching for a particularly elusive chameleon in a forest of ever-changing colors.
That's a pretty spot-on analogy.
Yeah.
But we'll get to how they finally cornered this human chameleon in part 2.
You know what's fascinating about this case is the contrast between Hamlet's haphazard plan and the highly coordinated strategic response from law enforcement.
Yeah.
It's almost like a game of chess where one player is making these impulsive, almost comical moves, while the other is carefully thinking 5 steps ahead.
So we've got our amateur criminal mastermind on one side,
Yeah.
and on the other side, we've got a whole army of investigators,
Right.
all armed with technology expertise and a determination to bring Hamlet down. It's like a real-life David and Goliath.
Yeah.
Except in this story, David is a highly trained task force with warrants and forensic labs.
Exactly. And you can almost sense Hamlet's growing desperation as the net closes in. He's on the run, likely exhausted, paranoid,
Right.
and facing the very real consequences of his actions. Yet even then, there's this persistent belief that he can somehow outsmart everyone.
Wow.
That he'll find a way to slip through the cracks.
Which is, of course, where his arrogance and delusion really come into play.
Exactly.
He seems to have convinced himself that he's the protagonist in some kind of action movie,
Yeah.
destined to escape unscathed.
And that warped sense of reality is precisely what made him so dangerous.
Right.
He wasn't just running from the law.
Yeah.
He was running from accountability, from the truth of what he had done.
It's a disturbing thought. The idea that someone can commit such a heinous act and then essentially detach themselves from the reality of it all.
And that detachment is often what allows them to keep going,
Right.
to keep justifying their actions, even when faced with overwhelming evidence to the contrary.
So back to the manhunt. There were a few close calls, right?
Yeah.
Like that Halloween night sighting
Yeah.
and the false lead in South Carolina.
There were several moments where it seemed like Hamlett might actually slip through their fingers.
Really?
There was a credible sighting of him on Halloween night,
Wow.
which must have sent chills down the spines of anyone who knew what he was capable of.
Can you imagine trick-or-treating with your kids
Right.
and suddenly realizing the guy from the wanted posters is strolling down your street?
Oh my goodness.
Talk about a spooky Halloween encounter.
And then there was that false lead in Chapin, South Carolina, where it turned out Hamlett had family connections.
Oh, wow.
It seemed like every time the authorities got close, he would somehow manage to vanish into thin air.
Which is a testament to his ability to blend in,
Right.
to adopt different personas, to become a ghost in plain sight. It's unsettling to think how easily someone can disappear, even in a world saturated with surveillance and digital footprints.
It's true. And it raises important questions about identity,
Yeah.
privacy, and the challenges of tracking individuals who are determined to erase their past and reinvent themselves.
Right.
Even if it means doing so at the expense of others.
Okay, so how did they finally catch him?
Well, in a twist of irony, Hamlet's attempt to disappear ultimately led to his capture.
Oh, really?
He ended up checking himself into a hospital in Columbia, South Carolina, as a John Doe.
As a what?
As a John Doe,
Wow.
likely seeking medical attention and hoping to fly under the radar.
Talk about a bold move. Going to a hospital when you're a wanted fugitive seems like the opposite of blending in. What was he thinking?
It speaks to that element of desperation we talked about earlier. He was running out of options, and his need for medical attention might have overridden his usual caution. Or maybe deep down there was a part of him that wanted to be caught, a subconscious desire to end the charade.
Or maybe he genuinely believed that even in a hospital, surrounded by medical professional and security cameras, he could somehow pull off this John Doe act.
It's certainly possible, but in a stroke of luck.
Yeah.
Or perhaps fate, a hospital employee recognized him from a wanted poster. Talk about being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah.
For Hamlet, that is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that simple act of recognition, that willingness to see something, say something, brought the entire manhunt to a close.
So in the end, it wasn't some high-tech surveillance system
Right.
or a crack team of detectives that caught him.
Yeah.
It was a hospital worker paying attention, doing their job, and ultimately playing a crucial role in bringing a dangerous fugitive to justice.
It's a powerful reminder that we all have a role to play in keeping our communities safe.
Yeah.
It's not always about dramatic chases or shootouts.
Right.
Sometimes it's about the everyday acts of vigilance and the willingness to speak up when something seems amiss.
So they catch Hamlet, the jig is up, the charade is over. What happens next?
Well, the first order of business is confirming his identity,
Right.
which, given his penchant for aliases,
Yeah.
was probably more complicated than usual.
I bet.
But once they had him positively identified,
Okay.
it was time to face the music.
Yeah.
He was extradited back to Tennessee to face charges for Stephen Lloyd's murder.
And while we could spend hours discussing the legal proceedings,
Yeah.
the intricacies of the trial, the evidence presented, I think what's more important is to reflect on the human cost of this entire saga.
Absolutely. Because beyond the headlines, the manhunt,
Right.
the sensationalized details, there's a real victim.
Yeah.
A life tragically cut short, a family left to grieve, and a community forever impacted by this senseless act of violence.
And that's what gets lost in the shuffle sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah.
The very real human consequences of these crimes.
Right.
The ripple effects
Well-
that extend far beyond the immediate victims.
It's true. And while the capture of the perpetrator brings a sense of closure, of justice being served, it doesn't erase the pain, the loss, the trauma.
And it certainly doesn't answer the question of why.
Yeah.
Why would someone go to such extreme lengths,
Right.
construct such an elaborate web of lies,
Right.
and ultimately take another person's life?
Yeah. That's a question that will likely continue to haunt us, even as we delve deeper into the psychology of deception,
Yeah.
the motivations behind criminal behavior, and the factors that contribute to such a distorted sense of reality.
Okay, so before we get to the why of it all,
Right.
let's take a step back and consider the sheer absurdity of this case.
Okay.
We've got a faked bear attack, a stolen identity, a cross-state manhunt, and a suspect who seems to have genuinely believed he could pull it all off.
Yeah.
And almost comical if it weren't so tragic.
You're absolutely right. It's like a bad crime novel full of cliches and over-the-top plot twists.
Yeah.
Except the consequences are very real.
Right.
And I think that's what makes this case so fascinating, so disturbing, and ultimately so important to discuss. Because it forces us to confront the darker side of human nature.
Yeah.
The capacity for self-deception,
Right.
the lengths to which some individuals will go to evade responsibility,
Right.
and the tragic consequences that often follow.
So let's dive into those darker aspects, the psychology of it all, and explore the possible explanations for Hamlet's warped sense of reality. So we've got this guy, Nicholas Hamlet, who thinks he can outsmart everyone.
Right.
He cooks up this ridiculous scheme, fakes a bear attack, steals an identity.
Yeah.
And he actually believes he can get away with it.
Yeah.
What's going on in his head?
That's the question that keeps criminologists and psychologists up at night.
Yeah.
How can someone be so detached from reality?
Right.
It's a complex mix of factors, but one thing we often see in these cases is a profound sense of narcissism.
Narcissism. So like he's looking in the mirror thinking he's some kind of criminal mastermind.
It's more than just vanity.
Yeah.
It's a deep-seated belief in their own exceptionalism. They genuinely believe they're smarter, more cunning, and more capable than everyone else.
Right.
Rules don't apply to them. Consequences are for other people.
And that belief system, that's what allows them to justify their actions.
Right.
Even when those actions are clearly harmful, even when they're hurting others.
They construct this elaborate mental framework where they're always the victim, always justified.
Right.
They minimize the impact of their actions, shift blame,
Yeah.
and convince themselves they're doing what they need to survive.
It's like they build this wall around themselves.
Right.
A wall made of denial and self-deception.
Yeah.
And anyone who tries to break through that wall to challenge their narrative
Right.
becomes the enemy.
That's why it's so difficult to reason with individuals who exhibit this kind of narcissistic personality disorder.
Right.
They're not interested in logic, empathy, or accountability. Their primary goal is self-preservation, even at the expense of others.
Which brings us back to Stephen Lloyd. He becomes collateral damage in Hamlet's twisted game of self-preservation.
It is.
It's heartbreaking.
And it underscores the very real human cost of these crimes.
Yeah.
We often focus on the perpetrators, their motives,
Yeah.
their methods, but we can't forget the victims, the families, the communities forever impacted by these acts of violence and deception.
And it's not just physical harm, right?
Absolutely.
There's the emotional trauma, the shattered sense of security,
Yeah,
the ripple effects that continue long after the headlines fade.
absolutely. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to delve into the psychology of these cases, to try and understand the warning signs,
Yeah.
and to advocate for support systems that can help prevent these tragedies from happening in the first place.
Because catching the bad guy, that's only part of the equation.
Right.
We need to address the root causes.
Exactly.
The societal factors, the individual vulnerabilities that contribute to these cycles of violence and deception.
I couldn't agree more. It's about creating a society where empathy and accountability are valued,
Yeah.
where individuals are empowered to make healthier choices,
Right?
and where victims are supported, not forgotten.
Okay, so one last question before we wrap things up. Do you think someone like Hamlet ever truly understands the gravity of their actions?
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
Some individuals, through therapy and introspection, might eventually come to terms with the harm they've caused. Others might never truly grasp the extent of their wrongdoing, clinging to their justifications and rationalizations until their dying day.
It's a sobering thought,
Yeah.
and it leaves us with a lot to ponder.
Yeah.
Not just about the nature of criminal behavior,
Right.
but about the human capacity for both good and evil,
Yeah.
for empathy and cruelty, for delusion and truth.
And perhaps in grappling with these questions,
Right.
in seeking to understand the complexities of the human psyche, we can begin to build a world where stories like this one become less about sensationalized crime
Yeah.
and more about collective accountability and a shared commitment to creating a safer, more just society for everyone.
Well said. And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder those big questions. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a truly bizarre and disturbing case. We'll be back next week with a brand new deep dive. But in the meantime, stay curious, stay informed, and remember, sometimes truth really is stranger than fiction.